All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. We are going to pack 527 years of Venezuelan history into the next few minutes. Just imagine opening your eyes to a world of pristine coastlines and dense, untouched jungles, populated by people who have absolutely no idea that their entire trajectory is about to change forever. That is exactly where our story begins. We're tracing a wild path of staggering wealth, revolution, and unbelievable transformation.
And think about the sheer irony of where this all ends up. On one hand, you start with this totally isolated land at the end of the 15th century, completely cut off from the global economy. And on the other hand, you look at the modern nation, a country possessing the world's largest proven oil reserves. They are literally sitting on an ocean of wealth, yet experiencing one of modern history's most severe economic collapses. It's a complete paradox.
So, how does that actually happen, right? How do you go from a quiet, isolated land to an economic collapse of that magnitude? To really figure that out, we have to look way past the modern headlines. We need to go back 527 years and see exactly how this unfolded, piece by piece.
Okay, let's wind the clock back to 1498. That's when Christopher Columbus arrives, bringing this massive wave of outside contact. A year later, Spanish explorers spot these indigenous stilt houses built over the water, and they name the region Venezuela, which actually means Little Venice. The 1500s are all about rapid colonization driven by a ruthless pearl trade along the coast. But eventually the pearls run out. By the 1600s, they realize the real money isn't in the water anymore. It's in the dirt. Enter the cocoa economy.
Now put yourself in the shoes of a Spanish merchant back then. You're standing at a bustling port. A ship rolls in from the New World, and you yell to the captain, "Another shipment?" The captain shouts back, "Yes." You excitedly ask, "Gold?" And the captain just goes, "Nope, cocoa." You'll probably be thinking, man, I really guessed wrong. Because that initial obsession with finding golden cities, it vanished. It was completely replaced by a booming agricultural export economy. Chocolate was becoming an absolute global sensation, and Venezuela had the perfect climate to grow it.
But, and this is a really crucial point, that early economic success came at a horrific human cost. The cocoa boom created astronomical wealth for a select few, but those massive plantations relied heavily on the grueling labor of enslaved people. This wasn't just an economy, it was a deeply rigid social structure. You had a tiny elite controlling all the land and wealth, while everyone else lived in extreme poverty. And if history tells us anything, it's that economic models built on that kind of deep societal inequality, they almost never last.
So you have this intense tension building just beneath the surface for generations. That kind of rigid divide meant the status quo was basically a ticking time bomb. But nobody saw exactly what was going to happen next.
Enter Simón Bolívar, El Libertador. He becomes the central figure who actually taps into that centuries-long tension and ignites the War of Independence against the Spanish Empire. And Bolívar wasn't just some general. The guy was a sheer force of nature. He led armies across freezing, treacherous mountain passes and brutal battlefields with a vision so incredibly powerful that it completely rewired the region's political landscape forever.
But here's the crazy part. Winning that war actually created a whole new set of massive problems. The whiplash is insane. First, they kick out the Spanish. Second, Bolivar achieves his ultimate dream of creating Gran Colombia, this massive unified republic. Third, almost immediately, Gran Colombia totally collapses under the weight of geographic barriers and regional rivalries. And fourth, this sudden fracture plunges a newly independent Venezuela into decades of sheer political chaos, with warlords, caudillos, constantly fighting for control.
Now, while the political scene is an absolute mess, the economic engine just kind of pivots. The decline of the cocoa economy was seamlessly replaced by the sudden rise of the coffee economy. Global tastes shifted and the plantations adapted. But notice what didn't change at all. They were still completely reliant on agricultural exports, and that massive gap between the wealthy landowners and the rural workers still very much there.
For hundreds of years, that was the deal. But then, everything changed. That centuries-old reliance on agriculture was about to be totally eclipsed by something discovered bubbling beneath the murky waters of Lake Maracaibo. Enter the black gold.
1922 marked that year down because it is the year everything flips upside down. A massive oil well known as Barroso No. 2 blows out at Lake Maracaibo. We're talking a geyser of crude oil shooting hundreds of feet into the air for 9 days straight. Suddenly, the world beneath their feet was worth astronomically more than anything they could ever grow on top of it. It changed the entire trajectory of the nation overnight.
And this transformation was a real double-edged sword. On one hand, you get a massive oil boom that brings in an absolute avalanche of foreign money. Sleepy agricultural towns are suddenly transformed into modern cities with soaring skyscrapers and highways. A growing middle class even helps push the country toward democracy. But the catch? Total economic reliance on oil. They effectively stopped producing almost everything else.
So from the outside, with these gleaming cities and a booming population, it looked like the ultimate success story. But it wasn't. That incredible, fast-flowing wealth was masking a massive structural vulnerability, just waiting for the global market to expose it.
Jump to the 1980s, and the inevitable happens. The global oil market crashes, and the money dries up instantly. By 1989, the sheer shock of this, combined with severe austerity measures, triggers the Caracas riots, days of deadly protests in the capital. This massive social fracture opens the door for a charismatic former military officer, Hugo Chávez, is elected in 1999, promising to sweep away the old elite, which kicks off the Bolivarian Revolution in the 2000s.
And this brings us to a fatal structural flaw that stuck around no matter who was in charge. During the Bolivarian Revolution, oil prices surged again, which funded massive social programs. But here's the absolute kicker. Over 90% of government export revenue was coming entirely from high oil prices. They were overwhelmingly tethered to a single commodity. Basically, they were buying their food, their medicine, their everything with oil money.
Now, that system hums along just fine as long as global oil prices stay historically high. But markets do what markets do. They fluctuate. And then disaster struck.
After Chávez's death in 2013, Nicolás Maduro takes over. And almost right on cue in 2014, global oil prices completely fall off a cliff. The mechanism funding the entire country just breaks. By 2016, the government is printing money to cover huge deficits, and hyperinflation spirals totally out of control. Add in heavy international sanctions by 2019, further isolating them, and you get a historic, unprecedented economic collapse. It is super easy to get lost in the economic statistics here. So let's put this into human terms. Imagine if nearly every single person in a city the size of London just disappeared. That is the sheer scale of the mass migration out of the country. Millions of everyday people packed whatever they could physically carry and crossed borders just to survive.
And for those who stayed, the reality was a daily struggle. Hyperinflation didn't just shrink the economy on some spreadsheet. It completely wiped out daily life on the streets. Entire neighborhoods watched local businesses vanish one by one. Grocery store shelves were completely bare. People saw their entire life savings turn to dust in weeks by hyperinflation so bad that actual physical currency was blowing through the streets like garbage. Which brings us to today, a nation with so much incredible potential currently locked in a state of suspended animation. History really does have a weird habit of repeating itself, which leaves the future of present-day Venezuela completely up in the air. So the big question we're left with is this. If a nation can go from an isolated coastline to a global oil superpower, and then into a historic collapse, if Venezuela surprised the world once, could it do it again? That is the massive, profound question mark we have to leave you with today. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack 527 years of history in this explainer. If you found this breakdown fascinating, definitely stick around for our next explainer, where we are going to dive into the unbelievable rise and fall of Argentina. It is another absolutely wild story of wealth, collapse, and historical irony.